I'm very confident that everyone now is familiar with the term social distancing. And you could argue as Christians, God expects us to distance ourselves, to have some social distancing from the world. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17, Paul says, "Therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you." Well, very similar to our modern calamity with this virus that we have now was a situation all the way back in the time of Moses that affected hundreds of thousands of the Lord's people, the children of Israel. You see, they too were instructed, commanded to practice what we might call social distancing, but quarantine as well, due to a disease. And in Leviticus chapter 13, we learn about leprosy and what a problem that it was back in the time of Moses. And when I kind of looked up leprosy, looked up some information on it, and it wasn't considered a lethal disease, but it was a horrible disease that would rot your skin, and sometimes you would have it for years. So very devastating disease it was. And to deal with leprosy, God instructed the priests to deal with this disease and to examine the children of Israel when they were thought to have had leprosy. So they would, if someone thought that they had leprosy, they would come before the priest and he would examine them. And then if necessary, he would prescribe quarantine, or maybe social distancing, I guess we could say. In Leviticus chapter 13, verses 1 and 2 says, "The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron, the priest, or to one of his sons, the priest." So it goes on to explain in chapter 13 the criteria that the priest would be looking for when he examines this person to decide if he indeed had leprosy. And it says, if the spot appears deep in his skin, that he was pronounced unclean. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 4 says, if it does not appear deep, then that person was to be isolated for 7 days, or quarantined for 7 days, we might say. So the priest would examine him, he would take a look, and if he had symptoms of the disease, but it hasn't quite developed, he would send him off in isolation for 7 days. Then the priest would return 7 days later to re-examine him. And if he found that he had not developed the full-blown disease, he would send him off for another 7 days of quarantine. So the person who was thought to have leprosy, if he had symptoms of a disease, he was quarantined for 14 days. Does that not sound familiar to what we're dealing with now? In Leviticus chapter 13, again, verses 45 and 46 says, "But for the unclean, the leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean!' He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So you see, when a person was found to indeed have leprosy, he was quarantined, isolated, set apart from the rest of the children of Israel to live in isolation. He was to pronounce to everyone that he had it. He or she had it. They were to wear their hair in a certain way. But they weren't, the purpose of this isolation was not so that it would spread among others. Unlike our social distancing, where we are quarantined at home, told to be in isolation, to stay away so we can stop the spread of disease for our health. This was a different situation. You see, no unclean thing was to go before the Lord. To be in the presence of God, to dwell with the Lord's people, nothing was to be unclean. This was the reverence God expected of his people, those who were set apart, his chosen nation, which is now the church. So we know that priests were required to be Levites. But even if you were a Levite, young man, if you had any type of physical deformity, you were not allowed to be a priest. It was improper. It was considered unclean. Well, thankfully, we are not commanded to follow the many detailed statutes and minute details of the Mosaic Law today. But God demands that reverence from our worship today from us. Isn't that the very purpose, the reason that we walk the face of the earth, that he created us? Isaiah 43 verse 7, everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and I made, whom I created for my glory. We just glorify him in a different way. Why would we even have elders in the church if it didn't matter how we worship, if we could just worship any way we wanted to? God commands the reverence. We all know John 4:23 that talks about the worship that we are to have today. It says, but the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. You know, there's a remarkable passage in the Old Testament that is very similar to this, that was commanded of the people of the Old Testament. Joshua chapter 24, verse 14, the New King James Version says, now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth. You see, even in difficult circumstances, we're still commanded to worship God. You know, I think about the situation of Paul and Silas. In Acts chapter 16, verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Even in this difficult situation that they were in, we think we're in a difficult situation, they were in prison. And what were they doing? They were singing and they were praying to the Lord. I just think it's important during these trying times, these difficult times that we are in, that we do not forget the big picture. I've always had such great respect for Moses, and I think about the passage in Hebrews chapter 11, when the writer mentions Moses and his great faith. And it says in Hebrews chapter 11, you see, because Moses had the option of living as royalty, but it says he would rather be mistreated with the children of Israel, with God's chosen people, than live as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 26, it says, talking about Moses, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. We have a lot of distraction now. Our lives have really been interrupted. That's why you're watching this video now, because of all the distraction that's going on in our lives. But let us not forget our worship. Let us make sure that this time doesn't distance ourselves from the Lord and the worship that He commands from us.